but I think both Obama and McCain in 2008 really run presenting themselves as men who are different, as ones who talk off the cuff, who say what they really mean. And again, I'm not going to say they're complete phonies, because I do think, there were many times where you can see a McCain press gaggle where there is a spontaneity there, and he's kind of joking and conveying what he really thinks. And same with Obama, he could be very sort of thoughtful and straightforward and candid. But it is a myth to think that any politician refrains from the spin game. Again, it's just the language in which we talk. It's unreasonable or naive to expect that a candidate could avoid it altogether. And, with Obama, you really saw it in this very negative campaign he ran against Hillary Clinton starting in the fall of 91, but which he manages to do without getting his fingerprints on it too much, and trying to make her look like the one who's gone negative. So they had this slogan, "Change you can believe in." And at first blush, that seems like a hopeful, straightforward message. But it's also a dig at Hillary, saying you can't believe her, calling her dishonest, imputing to her an insincerity.
Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.
the strategy. It's a bit overblown. We tend to, if you think about Hollywood movies, from The Candidate to Wag the Dog, there's this old trope of sort of the, villainous or malign genius behind the politician who's this empty suit. And, as I said earlier, that's not really the case. Politicians do have convictions. They go into politics because they believe in things typically, and they want to advance those convictions. But of course, on the campaign trail, they often do trim and hedge and craft their words with such care so as not to say something wrong, not to alienate someone, that the press and the public sort of began to feel that it was all, phony and scripted, and they weren't really seeing their candidates because of all of this crafted, planned, cautious thinking that was urged on them by these consultants, or as they were called around the time, handlers. And the handlers term, especially, it's one that came up in relation to people like Reagan or Dan Quayle, Bush's vice president, who were seen as, too risky to let them just speak off the cuff and be themselves. So the handler implies someone who's always by their side, making sure that things go according to script.
The news management intensity seemed to really ramp up when Bill Clinton took office. As we entered the 24-hour news cycle, as you point out, with new networks and channels, and we're bombarded by this proliferation of partisan political panel discussions. But Clinton too relied heavily on the polls, especially considering the numbers of crises that he faced.
Yeah, and the polling is something else that really goes back. FDR used polls. I write about his pollsters. Really starts to take off with Nixon. I mean, that's where you see polling being brought in on any number of, I wouldn't say small decisions, but kind of just regular everyday policy questions. How do we do this? How do we do that? And, it continues pretty persistently to this day. Clinton also came to see that with cable television, it wasn't just the cable news channels, although that was part of it. But, we forget that kind of into the 70s, even somewhat into the 80s, people basically are looking at these three main channels. And in the 80s and then in the 90s with cable, there becomes, this infinite number of options on television at any given time. This is, of course, pre-internet, but it means the president doesn't have that same pipeline to the public. It used to be the president wanted to make a speech to the nation, would give an Oval Office address, and all three major networks would cover it, and you could count on tens of millions of Americans watching it. That's starting to crack in the 90s because people they don't watch it, or this network won't cover it. And Clinton starts doing things like using the Weather Channel to go on and talk about climate change. Talking to, targeting messages to African Americans over Black radio. There's a kind of effort to say, okay, we have a new or changing media landscape, and we can't just rely on the big three networks and kind of the old strategies. We need to start tailoring our communications for different niche channels to reach different niche constituencies, and in some way, and local news. I mean, Clinton really would always get beat up hard by the Washington press corps. There was just a kind of hostility there. But if he would go around the country, which he liked to do, and speak to local television, in Nashville or Oklahoma City or wherever it might be, he would get a much more respectful and even deferential, platform. And the local news anchors would be less inclined to kind of hit him hard, like Sam Donaldson or someone like that. And, here's the president visiting our town. And why are you here, Mr. President? What's your message for, people in our state? And that was another venue that he devised.
And I guess for George W., his first political challenge took place right after his election, and those challenges followed throughout the Iraqi war. But really, during his administration, his publicity department was as efficient at managing the news as any administration.
Yeah, Bush really imposed a kind of discipline. So for at least for most of his administration, there was a sense that everybody was on message, everybody was following the same talking points. Many White Houses, there was this kind of chaotic feeling where, people were backstabbing and bad-mouthing one another, and an enterprising reporter could really go get all these different perspectives and find out about the conflicts and the doubts within the administration. Bush, at least sort of in his first term, was very good about imposing that discipline. And particularly because we were at war, it came to feel to a lot of people that the discourse and debate was being stifled. Now, I don't think there was anything, illegal or even necessarily undemocratic about an administration saying we need to stay on message. I mean, that's how communication works. But it did give rise to this kind of embattled feeling that we're getting something of a wartime propaganda machine.
So now in the mid 2000s, we enter into the world of social media and also into that claim of no spin, or another way to phrase it, authenticity. And those descriptions were supposed to apply to both Barack Obama and his Republican opposition, Senator John McCain. Was there such a thing as an authentic candidate for those?
Right. This goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago with, say, the Time Magazine Year of the Handlers cover. The public by now is so aware of the layers of spin and image and message craft that go into every public statement, every candidate's posture, that they're kind of hungry for someone who seems to reject all that. And of course, different candidates do it to different degrees. But I think both Obama and McCain in 2008 really run presenting themselves as men who are different, as ones who talk off the cuff, who say what they really mean. And again, I'm not going to say they're complete phonies, because I do think, there were many times where you can see a McCain press gaggle where there is a spontaneity there, and he's kind of joking and, conveying what he really thinks. And same with Obama. He could be very sort of thoughtful and straightforward and candid. But it is a myth to think that any politician refrains from the spin game. Again, it's just the language in which we talk. It's unreasonable or naive to expect that a candidate could avoid it altogether. And, with Obama, you really saw it in this very negative campaign he ran against Hillary Clinton starting in the fall of 91, but which he manages to do without getting his fingerprints on it too much and trying to make her look like the one who's gone negative. So they had this slogan, change you can believe in. And at first blush, that seems like a hopeful, straightforward message. But it's also a dig at Hillary, saying you can't believe her, calling her dishonest, imputing to her an insincerity. And that's negative campaigning. And so he was very good at kind of, I think, having it both ways in that regard. McCain, too, obviously had to, accommodate himself. There were a sort of famous moment where he had said some negative things about some of the Christian right preachers like Jerry Falwell, that he then had to sort of walk back because he was in danger of losing the Republican nomination without enough evangelical Christian support. So he did political things too. But somebody asked me when I was writing this book, what would be an example of something a politician today says or does that's not spin? So pervasive is. And someone else actually who was in that discussion, just informal discussion among friends or colleagues, provided an answer. McCain at a rally, was with this angry crowd who was attacking Obama. And one woman in the crowd said something like, well, he's an Arab, he's not American. And McCain just, you could see, like, dropped everything. And he said, no, ma'am, he's a good, decent man. He's a family man with whom I happen to disagree with on a lot of issues. But you could tell that that was just spontaneous and from the heart. And my friend said, he wasn't spinning then. Like that was, he was question of what would my handlers or consultants want me to say, and what's the right thing to say here. And I do think politicians are motivated, at times by a desire to do what's right, to do what they think is right. They have lines they will not cross when it comes to spinning or image making. But the pressures are such that a certain degree of calculation seems to enter into so much political speech, so many political appearances these days.
Well, so finally, David, Republic of Spin was published in 2016, right?
Yeah.
So, but a whole new level of publicity was taking place at that time, well, with the shocking election of Donald Trump. But even more recently, we've seen the world of communications turned upside down with the emergence of fake news and the development of artificial intelligence. Now, at least in the past, as humans, we were able to put on our cynicism antenna and be reasonably able to sniff out propaganda. With all of this new technology taking place, do we still have a chance at doing that?
I think we do. I noticed this about Trump too, that, unfortunately, my book went to press before Trump really emerged as a candidate in the 2015-16 election. So he's not in the book. And I would go on book tour and get all these questions about Trump. So it did force me to sort of think about him and what had this century of research, a century of American history that I had researched help teach me, that would help me understand Trump. And I considered actually for a moment writing an epilogue or sequel. I even had something of a title like Fake News, Alternative Facts, and Truthful Hyperbole, or Beyond. It was going to be called Beyond Spin, because I do think with Trump, there was a certain brazenness of the lying. And of course, all presidents have lied, and some, like Richard Nixon, lied a lot about important things. So we don't want to make Trump unique, but the brazenness and the casualness with which he lied. I think about his first day in office with the inauguration, where he says this is the biggest crowd of any inauguration, and you can see that it's false from the photos. Like, everybody knows that that's not true. So, and he doesn't seem to care. So that is sort of different. Nixon actually cared when people didn't believe his lies. There was a desire to be believed in a way that with Trump, we're sort of beyond that. But you talked about the human instinct, whether it's a cynicism, or we might even find a kinder word for that, just a good built-in skepticism that I think we have always brought to political speech, to rhetoric, to spin. I think often when we're at the cusp of a new era where there's new technologies being developed, new methods being developed, they kind of work well at first, but then we kind of catch on and we realize, oh, that story that's billed as sponsored content on my magazine website is actually an ad, and it's meant to look like a story, but it's an ad. We learn to suss these things out. There's a line, I think, from Sophocles, or I've seen it attributed to Sophocles: a lie never lives to grow old. And lies and deception, spin, can work in the short run. In the long run, I wouldn't say they never work. I mean, I think there are misconceptions about the past that remain widespread. But in general, time can bring the ability to question and debunk. And so it also goes with some of these techniques. So I think, many people now know when they're on social media or, swimming through this sea of fake news and alternative facts and so on, they know to beware. Sometimes we may jump at something, we have an emotional reaction, we think we know the full story, only to learn that, oh, well, we only saw, 2 minutes and 10 seconds of that video, but the preceding 2 minutes or the ensuing 4 minutes showed a very different context. So I think people do have the capacity to learn. I think there is an inherent skepticism that people particularly in a democratic society where you're inculcated with that kind of skepticism as a virtue. And it's a fine line, again, between a skepticism that says, okay, question authority, don't believe everything you read, which is good, and a kind of cynical nihilism that says, oh, the government always lies to us, and, which is bad. And so it is a matter of calibrating it. But I'm not convinced that the human capacity to resist propaganda is any weaker than it historically has been.
Well, David, I thank you so much for bringing this insight into the history of spin and its relevance to what we're experiencing now.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed talking about it, and hope listeners enjoyed the discussion.
And I thank all of you for tuning in. Remember, for online information about this and other podcast topics, as well as more information about the authors and historians, log on to www.outrageoushistory.com. Wow, that was great, David. That was I'm just going to stop recording here for a second.
Right.